Hello, everyone. This is the 173rd episode of Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean in Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. For this episode, I interview Italian author Mr. Roberto Amorosino as we discuss Juventus during the decade of the 1970s. Mr. Amorosino has in the past worked at international organizations in the human resources area between Washington, D.C., Paris, and Rome. He writes for the Italian sports website www.sportmemory.it and is the author of the Italian language book Venti di Calcio. Welcome, Roberto.
Good morning. Thank you. Thank you for the invite. Thank you for the opportunity to talk with you about football.
Can you introduce yourself and your trajectory into football?
Well, I'm based in Rome, Italy, right now, and this is where I watched my first football game many, many years ago. I think back in 1964. I went with my dad to the Olympic Stadium to watch a Roma Juventus game, 1-1, by the way. Maybe this is where I started. Maybe at that time I was already collecting football cards, but definitely going to the game made the difference to be attached to football. And that's how it started. As you mentioned, I followed football since the beginning. I had a chance to work with Corriere dello Sport, one of the three Italian sport daily newspapers. And this is quite unique. Still today, there are three daily sport newspapers in Italy. I worked there for 7 years as a young collaborator, young journalist. And then after, I ended up doing different things, but still following the game very closely. And as soon as I retired, to some extent, I felt again about writing about football. As you mentioned, I had a chance through a blog and still have a chance to write about football. I wrote short stories about football, a bit of an unknown stories about unknown players, so not very well known games. But so I see like the lame, I'm a sort of a freelance right now. Thank you.
So let's go back in time. Can you present the status of Juventus in the Italian cultural landscape at the onset of the decade of the 1970s?
So Juventus, by definition, I would say, is the most popular team in Italy because of the number of titles, the number of fans. The generation of Omar Siveri, Charles in the early 60s managed to win a couple of titles. And then there was the beginning of the two teams of Milan. They started to dominate the Italian league. Juventus, I don't want to say by chance, but by surprise, managed to win the title of 66-67 season at the very last game, overtaking Inter Milan. And there was something, I would say, unexpected because not planned to some extent. So it was clear at that point, and the following season confirmed with three different winners, 68, 69, and 70, three titles by AC Milan, Fiorentina, and Cagliari. It was clear that Juventus had to some extent to reconstruct, and maybe Inter Milan was going down to some extent, the end of a cycle. Juventus managed to get the most important and most qualified general manager at that time, Italo Lodi, and that was the beginning of the reconstruction. So the Agnelli family and the president of the team, Giampiero Boniperti, together with Italo Lodi, reconstructed a team that started to build with new Italian fresh blood, very promising talents, managed to start something that ended up really dominating the 70s to some extent. So the three major players in terms of major figures in this context were the president, Giampiero Boniperti, the general manager, Italo Lodi, former with Inter Milan, and the new coach, Armando Picchi, There was a famous as well Inter defender, but very young, very fresh as a coach. And the three of them created something that developed and translated in several titles in the following year, even if Armando Picchi was not part of the story because unfortunately a terrible disease took him away very young.
The previous decade had seen the two Milan clubs excel in Europe. Was this a challenge that Juventus publicly wanted to emulate?
Yes, absolutely. These are the three most powerful teams in Italy for the number of titles and because they are definitely the three teams with more fans, more followed by the media for the very same reason, with fans all over the country. So they're not limited in their own city, especially Juventus, as they say, it's a Torino team that is the team with most fans in Italy. So the number one in Italy, and sometimes they say the number two in Turin. Sometimes in the city, Torino is more popular. Juventus might have less fans. Maybe this is controversial, but that's a way the story can be told. While in the rest of the country, especially in the south, there are a lot of Juventus fans, but also in other regions. And that's something that Juventus in the early 70s actually paid a lot of attention. A lot of the young players came from the south of Italy. Players like Furino, Anastasi, players from Rome, Causio from Puglia, a lot of players. And this created even more the passion for Juventus, both in the industrial Torino, a lot of workers in the Fiat factories were actually emigrated from the south, but also in the rest of the country with this passion for the black and white team.
What was the backbone of Juventus side as this decade started?
The backbone in the early 70s was made, as I was saying, by these new players that rapidly they grow in the team and created also opportunities for them to join the national team. So I'm thinking of players, as I was saying, like Causio and Bettega, to some extent the two wings. Causio, the player with imagination, dribbling, really talented, able to not only to score, but more importantly, to be the final assist man for the two strikers, Anastasi and Bettega. And that's something that it's also, you can see both Causio and Bettega were products of the youth team. And the policy at that time was to send players for one season, maybe in second division or in smaller teams to grow, and Juventus got them back. Anastasi, probably the player that was more close to the fans, the real idol of the supporters. The different story because he was with Varese just before the 1968 Euro finals. And of course, Juventus was in the position to get him from Varese. And there's an historic match when Varese beat Juventus actually 5-0 before Anastasi moving to Juventus. Anastasi was very close to Inter Milan. He even played a friendly match with Inter Milan before signing the contract. But then Juventus was quicker. And again, the power of Allodi, the way he was able to operate in the transfer market made the difference. They were
Yeah.
not the only players. I mean, as I was saying, also in the midfield, there were very promising players like Furino, somebody that has won record number of titles with the team. He was actually the only Juventus player that ended up being called in the World Cup 70 squad. And this is interesting. This sends a message of understanding that Juventus at that point, just before the World Cup 1970, was not a power team. Out of the 22 players called for the national team, the only Juventus player was actually Giuseppe Furino. He was not even a starter. He didn't have any cap in the national team before joining the World Cup. The team was made by players of AC Milan, Inter Milan, and more importantly, Cagliari at that time. So it was really a team made by different players from different teams. But Juventus was not very important at that point. Anastasi was, of course, also called in the national team, but unfortunately, at the very last minute, basically when they were going on the plane, he wasn't well. There was a physical problem, so he was replaced at the very last minute by Boninsegna, that, as you know, ended up doing pretty well in the World Cup, scoring in both semifinal and final.
And other players we can mention include in defense the likes of Antonello Cucuredu, Francesco Morini, who become part of the backbone of Juventus, Sandro Salvadore. You still have the West German Helmut Haller, who scored in the
Yes,
1966 World Cup final. He'd been at Bologna for many years, now was at Juventus.
legends.
And up front,
Absolutely.
you still have like Roberto Vieri as well as Anastasi. As this decade start, what was the extent of the involvement of the Agnelli family, particularly the brothers Gianni and Umberto?
Well, they were very, very involved. Definitely, Gianni was the owner, but
L'Avvocato, we should
the
say.
Avvocato was the owner, but also the most influential presence. Everybody remembers him at the games. He loved to follow the games. He was always at the beginning of the season among the players. He was very, very present. Everybody knew that he developed friendships to some extent, even in his own special, noble way with some players. There are thousands of stories of players that used to get a phone call 6:30 or 7 o'clock in the morning by him to check how things were going, to check if they were at home, if they were behaving, how focused they were on the next game. He was really involved, even if to some extent he totally trusted Boniperti in conducting the team and respected Boniperti's choices on the different coaches and managers that led Juventus at that time. So definitely very involved. Historically, the Agnelli family, they're always been involved, sometimes with more interest also in following the technical aspects, sometimes when things were working fine, being able to understand there was no need to interfere. So, but definitely ready to be there when needed.
Let's begin this decade with a 1970-71 season with transfers or important stories. This was a season where Juventus nearly won a European trophy, losing in the final of the Fairs Cup to Leeds United, and they finished fourth in the Scudetto race. Juventus with Armando Pichi as manager, but who would later be replaced by the Czechoslovak manager Sestmir Vipglacek. This was very important as far as the transfer activity. You have the likes of Roberto Bettega arriving from Varese, Fabio Capello arrived from Roma, Franco Causio arrived from Palermo, others like Lucky Luciano Spinozzi also arrived from Roma. And the players who left included the Spanish veteran Luis Del Sol, who joined Roma. Roberto Vieri also joined Roma. In fact, a number of players were offloaded to Roma. Roberto Vieri, Paolo Vigano, Gianfranco Zigoni, and the likes of Lamberto Leonardi and Gianfranco Leoncini were also offloaded to Atalanta, along with goalkeeper Roberto Anzolin. So we see a team overhaul in this transfer window that sets the stage for this coming decade. Despite the fourth place finish, was this season's transfers the most significant of the decade in kickstarting Juventus's fortunes?
Well, it was, as you know, you were making a long list because there were a lot of changes. And the result of the changes was really the coming of the fresh blood, as I was saying, from the youth systems, Causio and Bettega. They were playing for smaller teams, Palermo and Varese, for one season. Bettega scored a lot of goals. Causio seemed very promising, but it was still not clear how big he could be. But the main thing was this major transfer exchange between Rome and Juventus. Juventus acquired three players from Rome, Capello, Spinosi, and Landini, and gave a lot of players good names, but more at different stage of their careers, or very difficult to integrate, like Christian Vieri's father, the Bobo Vieri, the first Bobo Vieri. That was a huge talent, but very difficult to integrate in a team, ups and downs, every single game, every single season. So, and some players were also difficult to integrate, like Zigoni, and Del Sol was to some extent at the end of his brilliant career. So, younger team, very promising, very much in the mindset of Armando Picchi as a new coach. And that's why results during the season were okay, but not great, while they had a brilliant run in the Coppa delle Fiere. That was at that time the third European Cup, but still very important, where Juventus was unbeaten for the whole tournament. They didn't lose every single game, including the two finals with a big team, Leeds United. Actually, the three finals, because the first final between Juventus and Leeds United was suspended after, I think, 60 or 70 minutes because of the heavy rain. They had to stop the game. They had to replay the game. Juventus tied 2-2 in Turin. And then Mission Impossible in Leeds United, a very big team with Lorimer, Medley, Hunter, Clark as a forward. They tied 1-1 in Leeds. So because of the away goal difference, the cup went to the English, starting or confirming this nightmare for Juventus in the European scenario. It was not the first time that Juventus lost a final, and of course, many more to come in the years to follow. But it was a great run, gave international exposure and experience to the young team. And remember also that everything is happening in May, basically when Armando Picchi is very ill and is actually passing away. His last day on the training ground was in February. Since then, he left the team, so it was very difficult for the players, and they still managed to have a decent season in the league and doing very well in Europe.
For anyone who may not be familiar, can you explain the whole concept of the transfer wheeling and dealing in a hotel by the team owners and technical directors prior to the start of a season?
Yes, so that's an Italian thing that to some extent is still there, but of course has changed a lot. I think it started with one single guy that was the president of Palermo, I think, that decided or started to meet other teams' president or general managers or whoever to trade players or to discuss transfers with for his Palermo players, meeting counterparts in an hotel, in the lobby of an hotel in Milan, of course, close to the central railway station, close to Stazione Centrale in Milan. And this hotel that is still there is called Gallia. So he started, and this became pretty much popular. There were more teams doing the same things. And at some point, he was elected by natural choice by everybody as the place to meet, to discuss. And sometimes agreements were signed on a napkin, on a piece of paper, on a cigarette pack, or maybe just shaking hands. That's how it was. I'm talking about the mid 50s or the late 50s. The king of the Gallia at some point was recognized was Italo Lodi. Again, his ability to convince players to join. Maybe it was not too difficult to convince a player to join Inter Milan or later Juventus Milan or Juventus Turin, but definitely it was well respected. and other teams also joined. I think in the 70s, everything changed. The Hilton Hotel, still in Milan, made a better deal, a better offer. So everything moved to the Hilton. But this was the way players were traded. Remember, this was mainly in the summer break, right? In the summer season.
For any Englishman listening, Italo Alodi is the one that Brian Glanville for decades has attacked. He
Right.
blames him for all the match fixing at European level involving Italian clubs.
Yeah.
Let's get back to Juventus's important coaching change as well. You mentioned Armando Pichi would pass away at a very young age. I believe he was like 36 years old when he passed away, if I'm not mistaken. And of course, you now have a new Juventus manager, the Czechoslovakian Sestmir Viplacek, who also we should mention is the uncle of Zdenek Zeman, famous coach 2 decades later. What can you say about him and his impact at this point to Juventus?
Well, first of all, just wishing all the very best to Zeman, that we know is not in good health right now. And being from Rome, he has been very important for both Roman teams at some point. He's also a visionary, very different kind of coaching. Everybody loves him for his style, even if again it's not an easy character, but most importantly, he will feel better soon. His uncle, Cesto, as they called him, Čestmir Vikpalek, is actually, again, Boniperti is instrumental to choose him as a not an obvious choice as a Juventus coach. He didn't have a strong coach pedigree, but Boniperti knew him well. So he was helping Juventus as a scout, as coaching junior teams. They followed him while he went to Sicily. Because Vic Palek, as you were saying, was from Czechoslovakia. He left, he played in Czechoslovakia, then in Italy, a decent midfielder. He was actually a teammate of Boniperti. And then when he started coaching, again, he went to Sicily and in Turin. Juventus made this very complex choice to choose him as a coach because, again, he didn't have any titles or any winning records with him. He was a good guy, meaning he was really able to manage the team, able to talk to the young people. It was the perfect choice also probably to still allow Boniperti not to interfere, but to be together with the team, something that he liked.
We come to the 1971-72 season. That's when Gianpiero Boniperti starts his reign as a Juventus president. It's the year where Juventus regains the Scudetto in a very tight race. There's a satisfactory run in Europe where they get eliminated in the quarterfinals of the Fairs Cup against Wolverhampton Wanderers. Surprisingly, the transfer activity is very light because most of the important transfers were done the previous season. So you have a new goalkeeper coming on board, Pietro Carmignani from Varese, as well as a defender, Silvio Longobucco from Ternana. Otherwise, the backbone of a team remains the same. This was really the season, I guess, that kickstarted Juventus's wins. So, what had made the difference from the previous season for such a jump from fourth place to first place?
Well, as you were saying, the team was growing. I don't think new players made a lot of difference. The ones you mentioned, Longobucco, even the keeper, Carmignani, had an okay season. The team was brilliant because they survived after losing Bettega in the middle of the season. In the middle of the season, he had some breathing disease, I don't know, pleurite in Italian, probably something similar in English. It must be a Latin word. So he was out for the rest of the season. He was replaced on the pitch by a player, Novellini, that did okay, but not really contributing. Anastasi was definitely more important in terms of scoring, in terms of participation in the attacking. So they managed to keep the lead, as you were saying, the decent run at the European level. But of course, opposite to the previous season, there was more concentration on the national title. And so after 5 years, we mentioned the 67 title. After 5 years, Juventus ends up winning their title number 14. It's interesting. It's previously was 62, 67, 72. So every 5 years, Juventus is back on top. But there's a feeling that this is the beginning of something. Remember Gigi Riva, Gianni Rivera, Sandro Mazzola. They're definitely still leading their teams to the point that they still are in the Italian 74 squad in the World Cup, but they're getting older. Riva suffering by injuries, Mazzola and Rivera having their primes in the 60s or in the late 60s. So Juventus is also taking advantage of the end of the cycles of these teams, rival teams.
We come to the 72-73 season, and Juventus wins a second consecutive Scudetto in a dramatic fashion. However, there's the first final loss in the Champions Cup in Belgrade to the great Ajax side of Johan Cruyff. As far as players coming in, you have the legendary goalkeeper Dino Zoff arrived from Napoli, as well as former Milanista, the Brazilian Jose Altafini arrived from Napoli. The players who left, obviously, Carmignani exchanged places with Zoff and went to Napoli. Novellini that you mentioned, Adriano Novellini, he joined Bologna. This was one of the best Juventus sides with Zoff in goal, and you still have the backbone of a team that we mentioned before. You have this league title race where it looks like AC Milan is about to win the title. But on the final day of the season, Juventus wins at Rome while Milan lose 5-3 at Verona and Juventus overtakes them. Actually, Lazio was also in the hunt. They were also like a point behind, but they also lose on the same day at Napoli, and Juventus just leapfrogs over these teams and win their second consecutive title. But in the Champions Cup, there's the important win over Derby County in the semifinals, but then there's a loss against this great Ajax side. So it could have been a dream season.
Yes, I don't know where to start. As a kid, that was probably my preferred season, also because I was at the game. I was at the Roma Juve final game, so I remember everything and I want to share with you a few memories. First of all, you might not know. So the situation at the end, we're talking about May 20, 73, last game of the season. As you were saying, AC Milan is on top. They played on the Wednesday before, they played the Cup Winners' Cup final in Salonic, Greece, against again Leeds United. And it was a battle of Salonico. AC Milan scored almost at the beginning of the game and then played solid defense, honestly, for 90 minutes. The hero of the game was William Vecchi, AC Milan keeper, unexpected hero, and they managed to win. So definitely there was something, and they actually, it seems, we discovered years later that they asked to postpone the final match, maybe the three final most important match, Juventus Lazio, but the Italian league was not able to do so. It didn't make sense at that time. And so they played in Verona, a team with nothing to lose, nothing to win. It was just the last game of the season for them. At that time, as you might know or not know, the only way to know about scores in the other games was through the radio. But the radio was not covering the first half of the matches. The program called Tutto il calcio minuto per minuto was starting between first and second half. Every game was followed in the second halves. So the situation at halftime, I knew because I was there, Juventus was losing with Roma 1-0. So chances was almost gone and limited. And then the radio started the program, and the first game to be connected was the Verona Milan, and the speaker Enrico Ameri said, "Here in Verona, Verona 3, AC Milan 1." And that was the most unexpected result ever in the history of the game. How come AC Milan conceded 3 goals in the first half of a game, end of the season for Verona, 3-1? So this reinvigorated Juventus, even if they're losing 1-0. Altafini came in, he tied the game. And then while AC Milan was actually going down 5-1, at 3 minutes to go, Cucuredo scored this goal that made Juventus going on top of the league. AC Milan ended up losing 5-3. Juventus managed to keep the score winning 2-1 with the Cucuredo's goal from the distance, from just outside the box. And at the same time, the news came that Lazio, the other contender, was losing 1-0 in Naples. So it was really, really huge for the fans, for the team, the pitch invasion, players, fans crying, Vic Palek, everything. 10 days later, it was the European Cup final. And this was I think for that time, the biggest fan invasion for a game. There were 40,000 Italians, Juventini, at the game. So high majority. The Dutch were much, much less present in the stadium, in the famous Red Star, famous in the Maracanã, as they call it, of the Red Star. The Dutch were favorites. They scored after a few minutes. Juventus had a couple of chances, but Ajax was in control most of the time. It was surprising that Cucuredo, the hero of 10 days before, was actually left on the bench. So it gave like a sign of Altafini, that didn't start the last game of the season, was in the starting team. So a couple of choices were a bit, and Altafini was an old player. He was quite regular at that time. You had players in the mid-30s, they were starting from the bench because at that point you were able to make substitutions. But he played from the beginning and he was in good form. He scored a lot of critical goals that season. Great player. But it was a bit of a surprise that Juventus, they didn't take the momentum of Cucuredo scoring an historic goal. It didn't start the game. That was a bit of a surprise. But other than that, Juventus didn't play a great game. They seemed tired. Of course, they were very worried about this team that was, to some extent, playing a sort of different kind of game with the two sides, with the attacking defenders to some extent. So there was a lot of concerns how to defend, how to. Cruyff didn't play one of his best matches, but again, they scored at the beginning and in their own ways, they didn't risk too much. Maybe Juventus had a chance with Altafini, if I remember, but not much. But it was a great season, and there was not much. It seems like they accomplished a lot, nevertheless, just by winning the title in that way.
And we have the images of all the Ajax players wearing Juventus jerseys,
Yeah,
lifting the cup. Yeah.
the good old times when
Uh,
these things were done. Yeah, I like
uh,
that. You're right. Yeah, Cruyff wore a Juventus jersey. You're
yeah,
right.
just about all the players, all the images I see is like
Oh yeah, yeah,
all
yeah.
the players with Juventus shirts.
It's a different world. Yeah, I remember Shirea also lifting
Oh yes.
a cup, a super cup with a Liverpool jersey.
Oh yes, that's right. 85. Yeah, yeah, of
Right.
course. Yeah. Let's discuss the 1973-74 season. As far as transfers, we have Claudio Gentile arriving from Varese. Paolo Rossi moves up from the youth team, but I don't remember he saw much action at that point.
No.
But you have Helmut Haller returning to Germany to Augsburg, and Alberto Marchetti goes to Arezzo. Again, the transfer activity is not as much as that first season. You have Giorgio Mastropasca, the defender, arriving from Ternana, and another player from Mantova, Fernando Viola, and a striker, Giuliano Musiello. But I don't think many of these players were able to crack into the first team. This is the year where Lazio wins their first Scudetto. Lazio have Kinalia. They win the Scudetto. Incidentally, Ajax had refused to play in the Intercontinental Cup. So Juventus plays against Independiente of Argentina, but they lose the final. It's poor season in Europe as they lose in the first round to East German side Dynamo Dresden. They finished second in the league title race to Lazio, but overall it's somewhat of a letdown from the previous season.
Definitely, Gentile was a big player for Juve in the years to come. Lazio was, I don't want to say predicted to win, but was an amazing team. I don't know if you have already had a chance to do a proper podcast on this group of players.
Not yet, but
Because
yeah.
there are a lot of, to say, inside and outside the field, the pitch, but it was an amazing team. And to some extent, even if it's a bit of a stretch, they were closer to the Dutch system of playing, right? They didn't last long. They didn't manage to have a cycle, but it's true that the season before they were very close to the title. Juventus, for some reason, didn't really manage to repeat themselves. They did okay. It's good that you mentioned the Intercontinental Cup final. Ajax refused to go to South America because all these previous troubles that AC Milan and other teams faced going there. So they refused to play. Juventus were the other finalists, so they were the choice to make the cup survives, and they discussed where to play. So for the first time was not two games, only one, and they choose Rome. It was an interesting choice because it was the same field where Juventus won the title 6 months before. And from 0-0, Juventus lose 1-0, and Cucureddo misses a penalty. There was a chance to win at that point to equalize the game. Boccini, amazing Argentinian talent, playing for Independente, scored. Juventus attacked the whole game, but didn't manage to score, and they lost. It was a bit of surreal. They played during the day. There were 40,000 people at the game. So for the Olympic Stadium, it looked like half full, half empty. So they lost again, one more, this international trouble, not able to win a single European trophy at that point. The season went okay. As you say, most of these players didn't really make a big impact. Mastro Pasqua was expected to replace Salvadore. More importantly, Helmut Haller, after an amazing career, he used to be called the Brazilian from Germany because he's amazing technical skills. And actually, I like to mention him because everything we know and we have seen from Franco Causio came also through playing together with Haller. Haller was very similar type of player, but of course, when he was getting older, he became slower, more of a midfielder than a wing. So, but Causio really technically and learned a lot through Helmut Haller. So, very important player. And of course, as you say, he went back home, not only back to Germany, back to his own town, but really an amazing player.
We come to the 1974-75 season with Juventus with a new manager, Carlo Parola. For anyone who may not know, he's the man who's in the cover of all the Panini
Yeah.
symbols. Juventus regains the Scudetto. This was their third in 4 seasons. They had a very strong run in Europe where they defeated Ajax and Hamburg in the UEFA Cup before finally losing in the semifinals to Dutch side Twente and Skede. As far as transfers, we have Sergio Brio arriving from Lech, who would become a fixture in the center of Juventus defense into the next decade. One of the most underrated players in Italy who perhaps deserved to play for the Azzurri but never got a chance. But nevertheless, he had a very long career with Juventus. We have Oscar Damiani arriving from Vicenza, Alberto Marchetti, midfielder arriving from Arezzo, and the young Gaetano Scirea arriving from Atalanta in defense. Many of the players from the previous season who didn't really make it, the likes of Giorgio Mastro Pasqua, he went to Atalanta along with Giuliano Muziello. Gianpiero Marchetti also went to Atalanta. Juventus, we can see that they're still maintaining their backbone with the likes of Zoff, Spinozzi, Furino Capello, Anastasi and Bettega, or Bobby Goal as it was called back then, and Causio, and just making minor adjustments season by season. So this was Juventus getting back to winning things again.
Yes, but thank you first of all to remind me the new players on board because sometimes it's difficult to. Well, you can imagine. I mean, thinking now that of Gaetano Scirea, what player actually Juve managed to acquire. There was a lot of collaboration between Juventus and Atalanta at that time for many, many years. I don't know if it sounds weird, but best Atalanta players from the youth system ended up with Juventus. Something that stopped with Donadoni at some point in the what is it in the late
80s, yeah.
80s or early 90s. I don't remember. Some point Donadoni, big promising player, expected to end up like any other to Juventus goes to a different team. And so that was the a change and this type of now there are two teams like any they talk, but that's not the same kind of relationship between the two teams. But you see some sort of continuity in the mind of the team. Mastro Pasqua and Scirea, even two planets aside in the long run, they were very similar. They were midfielders able to play in defense. And this was something that really Juventus and Parola was quite innovative to some extent. The team was able to have some very good games, very open, more aggressive. Again, pretty much copying or trying to copy Rinus Michels' Ajax system. Again, thinking of the radio halftime program, I remember that I think in the first part of the season, first versus second in the league, Juventus goes to Napoli to play. It was a very important game, and of course, sold out, the usual difficult environment to play in Napoli. And you start the radio halftime results, and they say Napoli 0, Juventus 3. And this was huge at that time. The game ended up 6-2 to Juventus. And this was the sign that between Juventus and the rest of the league that season, there was actually a good difference. So the team is young, but it's getting more experience. Anastasi is the captain. So I think they control the season pretty much to win.
We come to the 1975-76 season. Neighbors Torino would edge ahead in the Scudetto race. And Juventus would have somewhat of a poor season in Europe. They would be eliminated by Borussia Mönchengladbach in the second round. As far as the transfers, you have Sergio Gori arriving from Cagliari, Gianluigi Savoldi arriving from Vicenza, and Marco Tardelli arriving from Como. Paolo Rossi would be offloaded to Como. Brio would be loaned to Pistoiese. Longobuco would join Cagliari. Luciano Marangon, who would later win the title with Verona a decade later, he joins Vicenza. And Alberto Marchetti joins Novara. This is the Torino with the likes of with the two Gemelli del Gol, Francesco Graziani and Paolino Pulici, and many other internationals, Pecci, Claudio Sala, Patrizio Sala, Mozzini. Yeah, many good players. They win the Scudetto, their first since Superga. Juventus finishes second, so the city of Turin is occupying the first two places in the Scudetto race. Juventus come up short this season against a very good Torino side. This would lead to Carlo Parola being sacked at the end of the season.
Yes, everybody's very disappointed for the result of the season. It's also clear Torino is a great team. They win the title 27 years after Superga. That's a good thing for the game. Juventus may be favorites, but Torino deserves. You mentioned the players. I would also remember Zaccarelli as very important. And definitely Claudio Sala was probably the inspiration. And this rivalry that is always there, of course, between two teams translates in derbies for a few years regularly dominated by Torino. This is something difficult to accept by Juventus. It's not about losing or winning, but this sense of that Torino has a better spirit when they play the derbies is something that is really making the team thinking of we need to be stronger physically, stronger, more able to face teams that are, again, physically better equipped. Torino in Italy, and you see they lose to Borussia Mönchengladbach, okay, to some extent, there's another team that is very aggressive. There are signs that these teams need to do something to avoid the risk that despite having great players and also somebody like Tardelli joining and making the team stronger, there are things that are not really satisfying. And I'm saying this because it's really a change between the end of this season and the next one, also in really choosing players that I'm sure you will mention now in your next question that are going to make Juventus to some extent strong again and back on top.
This 1976-77 season would perhaps be Juventus's best season to date up to that point in history. You have the appointment of the legendary Giovanni Trapattoni on the bench, who at this point is a young manager in his 30s, and it's almost hard to imagine the legend that he would become. Obviously, he'd been an emblematic player of AC Milan, but he would become a legendary manager of Juventus. This was a season where Juventus not only wins a very tight Scudetto race with Torino, but they finally win in Europe and they win the UEFA Cup by defeating Spanish side Athletic Bilbao, and they eliminate both Manchester teams, City and United, along the way. As you mentioned, to toughen the team, you have Romeo Benetti joining the midfield, coming from AC Milan, and Fabio Capello goes in the opposite direction. And that also changes his trajectory, Capello, in the future. You have Roberto Boninsegna, another Inter legend. He joins the team as a veteran striker. You have the very young Antonio Cabrini, Bel Antonio, arriving from Atalanta, of course. And Alberto Marchetti returns from loan from Novara. The players who leave, you have the veteran Altafini joining the Swiss league, joining Chiasso. Anastasi, as exchange for Boninsegna, joins Inter. Oscar Damiani joins Genoa. And Gianluigi Savoldi joins Sampdoria. This is a star-studded Juventus side with Giovanni Trapattoni managing the side. The Scudetto race, both Juventus and Torino would have magnificent seasons. Juventus finally edging Torino by 1 point, and they get 51 out of 60 points, while Torino gains 50 out of 60 points. And Fiorentina in the third place was like 15, 16 points behind. That's how close Juventus and Torino were. It's a continuation of the league race of the previous season, but this time Juventus, with the grinta of Benetti and Trapattoni on the bench, wins the title, not forgetting the European adventure.
It is the season. Let me go back to make 1 point. So Juventus lost to Torino the season before by 2 points. And Juventus lost the final game of the season in Perugia 1-0. Okay, and remember there were 2 points for the win. And Juventus lost, I think, 45-43, something like that, with Torino. And maybe we should have mentioned this earlier about Boniperti. Boniperti has something that was quite unique at that time for a president. You know, there was this way of renewing contracts every season and discussing the salary increase, the new contract, the extension, and so on. And Juventus was known to be the only team at Boniperti time to close the renewals and the deals with the players in a few minutes. Some players, they start to have agents. Some players, generally speaking, they used to have even parents discussing salaries and package and contracts. But Juventus players were meeting Boniperti in his office every year, every summer, and he was able to make them sign the new contract really in a few minutes. Never had a problem, never had a controversy. At the beginning of the 76-77 season, he scheduled his appointments as usual with the different players, one by one, and player entering the room and sitting at his desk, they could find the picture of the last game of the season. There was a photo of the Perugia goal against Juventus. So it was like saying, we lost. We lost. So what do you want to discuss? What increase do you want to discuss? This is where we start. We start from this picture, from this losing. Meaning next season we cannot afford something like this. At the same time, there were rumors that the locker room, they were pretty much divided. And this is why probably also Parola ended up being sacked, not for losing, but for the whole thing. And again, a very challenging and visionary choice of young Trapattoni for the team. So young coach, but not on the field. So two fighters, very mature, very experienced, were chosen to fight Torino, because at that point it was a kind of an obsession. Juventus lost derbies, lost the title, and the only way to respond was to make the team much more solid. So these four players, Capello, Anastasi on the Juve side, and Benetti and Boninsegna coming into Juventus were actually very similar in terms of their stage in career. But Benetti and Boninsegna were chosen with this mission of making the team more solid, obsessed to win. And they were all both felt, Benetti and Boninsegna, for some reason, that their respective teams, AC Milan and Inter Milan, they were not believing in their possibilities to win and to make the difference. So Juventus was perfect for them to have one, two, maybe three seasons at the end of their career and give the best. And the whole team benefit. Juventus, for the first time, don't lose after a while, play a derby 0-0, hitting the two goal posts almost very close to win, but really demonstrating we can play you guys. And they didn't lose any single game. I mean, they lost two games in the whole season. As you were saying, 51 points versus 50 is unbelievable in terms of, losing only 9 points in the whole season. I remember they were neck to neck the whole, and there was a 1st of May, Labor Day in Italy game in Rome, Lazio-Torino, and this was the last point that didn't 0-0, that didn't allow Torino to be at the same point, and Juventus lasted to the very point. Again, Juventus played, we spoke about AC Milan losing after an international cup winning. Juventus finally wins a UEFA Cup, this time first European trophy, first Italian UEFA Cup, and first trophy for Juventus, this time with the advantage of the away goal, right? They 1-0 in Turin and 2-1 for Bilbao in the return match, and was really probably when they scored the 2-1 goal, there were 12 minutes to go, and I think for every Juventus fans, these have been the 12 most difficult minutes in their life as Juventus supporters, because Bilbao scores the second goal with 12 minutes to go, and Trapattoni had to confess that they were not able to do anything else. So he takes out Boninsegna for a central defender. It's like for Spinozzi. And that was like the sign, okay, we have to defend. There's nothing else we can do in these last 10 minutes because Bilbao was attacking. The crowd was crazy and the environment was crazy. You can imagine what it meant to play at that time. And that's, you were mentioned Cruyff with the Juventus jersey. We all have also this memory that they were really aggressive, almost dirty, the way they were supporting the team and also on the pitch. But as soon as the game ended, the crowd actually also applauded Juventus team and they allowed them to do a
A
lap
lap
of
of
honor
honor.
with a trophy that again in a ground that was 40,000 people by the home team was not granted. And it was a great European run, as you were saying, beating, thank you to the home games, beating both Manchester at home was something big. But the whole tournament was great when they played Shakhtar Donetsk from Soviet Union, the Ukrainian team, but from Soviet Union at that time, when they played
Magdeburg.
Magdeburg, AEK Athens, and Bilbao in the final. Thank you for okay. It was the season. It was the season. And no, there was, I was saying, 4 days after playing in Bilbao, no time to celebrate. They won the last game in
Oh,
Genoa
that's right.
with
Yeah.
Sampdoria 2-0 to make 51 points.
We come to the 1977-78 season. As far as transfers, we have Pietro Fana, still
Mm.
with hair, arriving from Atalanta, Vinicio Verza, arriving from Vicenza, and Pietro Paolo Virdis, with no gray hair, arriving from Cagliari. And the players who leave include Sergio Gori, who joins Verona, and Alberto Marchetti joins Cagliari. A certain Gianpiero Gasperini joins Reggiana. This is a season where Juventus once again gains the Scudetto, losing only one match during the season. Decent run in the Champions Cup, where Juventus eliminates Ajax but eventually lose in the semi-finals to Belgian side Club Brugge. To top it all off, more or less the entire Juventus squad, like 9 players, are part of the Italian squad for the 1978 World Cup, where Italy finishes fourth. Was this the zenith of Juventus in this decade?
They were the best team for sure. Torino was not able to compete as they did the 2, 3 seasons before. And as you were saying, the result that the national team was basically made by Juventus players. And there was a great national team, right? To tell that the Italian team came fourth doesn't tell the full story because it was a great World Cup that it could have done. As you know, the only team that managed to beat Argentina during that World Cup was Italy in the group stage. At the group stage, they played a great tournament. Then they got a bit tired and maybe not lucky in a couple of circumstances. Ended up not making the final and losing the third place final as well. But it was a great tournament. At the same time, yes, as you were saying, they dominated the league. They lost only one game. And in Europe, they did very well because losing to Bruges, even if you think, okay, they are not a superpower, Juventus was very close to the final. The second leg in Belgium, I still remember the name of the referee if you want, because he really made the difference, unfortunately. Juventus lost, I think, in extra time, but there was a clear penalty at some point. They could have easily tied the game, and that would have meant to go into the final and play in Liverpool. Maybe not as favorites, but still being there. And Fan actually played a great game in Belgium in that evening. I think the foul in the box was on him. That wasn't awarded by the ref. The whole game was not easy. Juventus got a red card. Anyway, good team, good season. Experience is getting there. Causio, Tardelli, and so on. And the 78 national team grows by the minute, meaning that two young players, Cabrini and Rossi not being a Juventus player at that point.
Well,
Uh,
Juventus owned half his contract, we should mention.
correct, correct,
Yeah.
yes. They didn't really see him probably. When he was in the youth system, he was more like a right wing, very light. Of course, we didn't know him at that point so much. We knew the name and we knew that he belonged to Juventus. They tried to play the same thing like going in a provincial team to emerge and to play. He finally made it. Of course, he had a great season, the 78 season with Vicenza, because really becoming second in the league was like a historic for Vicenza. And he was not the only top player there, but it was definitely clear at that point that he was of another league. And the national team benefited. As you know, the coach, Enzo Berzotto of the national team, trusted him, as he trusted the Juventus players more than the Torino players. I mean, he had this idea that playing with blocks was probably the thing to do. That's why you had 6, 7 starting players from Juventus, even if some of the Torino players were very close to challenge his decisions, right? Why Bettega instead of Pulici? Why Claudio Sala instead of Causio? They were not easy choices, but to some extent he always felt more confident playing the Juventus players, and the results were fine, even if sometimes it was clear that maybe a better balance of fatigue would have helped maybe the team better. Unfortunately, in the critical game with the Dutch in the 78 World Cup, there were no semifinals at that point. You had two groups. He did, with Italy winning 1-0, he did take out Causio for Claudio Sala, but it didn't work out. I mean, I'm not blaming Claudio Sala. But the reality was that the team actually ended up losing that match.
We come to the end of the decade. We come to the 1978-79 season. This is a season where Juventus finished third. AC Milan wins the title. And Juventus has a poor run in Europe. They lose in the first round to Scottish side Rangers. The season is somewhat saved with the win in the Coppa Italia final against Palermo. As far as players coming in, Sergio Brio comes back from his loan at Pistoiese. Luciano Spinoza leaves Juventus and joins Roma. The backbone of the team is still the same. Was this minor stagnation inevitable after the excesses of the previous season that included the World Cup?
Yes, I think so, actually. I think that's a lot to do with the World Cup. It's always difficult everywhere, but definitely in Italy at that time to confirm, to repeat. We spoke about Cagliari, we spoke about Lazio, we spoke about Torino to some extent. To repeat yourself and win again is always a bit of a challenge. On going out in the first round of the Champions Cup, I think it's worth mentioning that I remember that every year when there was a draw, the first draw for the first round, we were always hoping not to get British teams and Eastern European teams. You wanted to avoid these teams because they were much better prepared in September. Because the first division in England at that time was starting much earlier, and the same in Eastern Europe. So you really wanted to avoid these type of teams. You never know, they were better prepared without saying anything more, but so it was always a problem. So you remember Juventus went out with Dinamo Dresda and Rangers, and always playing there, the second leg always been a challenge, right? I have to admit that the UEFA Cup that we mentioned, 77, when Juventus eliminated City and United, luckily, both times Juventus played the second leg at home. They lost in both. Man City 1-0 there, Man United 1-0 there, but they managed to change the result in the second leg. 2 goals to City and 3 goals to United. This time you play Rangers after winning 1-0 in Turin with Birdi's goal and going close a couple of times to the second goal, hitting goal post. But then you go to Glasgow, you lose 2-0, and this was not something totally unexpected. Playing there in late September, that was still early in the season for Italy. They had a very few league games under their belt. So, and as you were saying, probably something to do also with the World Cup, playing there for the whole tournament because Italy played 7 games, so not totally unexpected. And Milan was the most. It was a weird season. Perugia came close second after AC Milan. AC Milan didn't have even a proper scorer. I think that the top scorer was like the left back, Maldera. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think he was the only one in double digit. And Perugia didn't lose a single game, but they tied too many games. But they had a great season, of course, for them.
Looking back at this decade, what was the catalyst for Juventus's renaissance?
Well, it was a very clear vision of what they wanted to achieve. And as we said, the pillars were the decisions they made to rebuild the team in a proper way, using Italian players, youth systems, having the financial means to get top players also from other teams, sometimes young, sometimes more experienced. So what they did in the early 70s, again, through the 3 names that we mentioned, even if only 2, unfortunately, were able to keep going. I mentioned Allodi, I mentioned Boniperti, and Boniperti making very smart choices in the different personalities of the coaches they selected. We were not talking about best potential managers in the market, like, I don't know, the Lidl or the Lenio Herrera or the Nereo Rocco of that time, but choosing the right mix between people that were able to talk and manage and coach both young and more experienced players, and a lot of leadership also. When you think of players like Gentile, Tardelli, Furino, Capello, Bettega, Causio, these are players, Zoff. I keep Zoff and Shirea on a different level, but these are players with strong leadership. Of course, I'm not talking only about their technical qualities, but also very smart, really able to understand Juventus expectations, growing with the team, benefiting from the team, and giving back to the team. And then you also have the silent or the leadership by example of people like Zoff and Shirea. I mean, an amazing group of people. Probably luck is also a component when you have so many players at the same time together. And to some extent, I think they could even won more at the international level to some extent. But if you think that to some extent, this is also the generation that ended up with the 82 World Cup, so they can't really complain.
If you go from the 60s to 70s, there's this power shift from Milan to Turin. And from like, I don't know, like 75 to like 78, let's say, Turin was the capital of the Italian calcio, and the national team, like we mentioned, was essentially made up of these two clubs, and as shown in the 1978 World Cup. So, how was that like for the city those years?
Well, I think it was a great feeling replacing Milan as football capital, right? So the rivalry was welcome. They both benefited. As I was saying, I think for 5 years, Juventus didn't win a derby, if I remember correctly. So they were really an obsession to play Torino. At the same time, this feeling of being able to replace Milan on the also in the international stage. Torino didn't have many opportunities. They had a European final at some point with a different group and generation. They had a couple of good games in Europe for different reasons. Juventus was longer, more solid, more talented altogether. The national team gave them also the international exposure where you make more experience, you play games at different levels, sometimes in big tournaments, and they were well equipped, especially, of course, again, we go back to the Agnelli family, right? The intercycle ends up to some extent when the Moratti father, get out of the team. A different group comes in with some results at the beginning, but not in the long run. AC Milan the same. So Juventus was the most solid for different reasons, but definitely to have a group like Agnelli, like Fiat behind, helped them a lot to be able to stay on top for a long time.
Many of these Juventus players would be part of the 1982 World Cup winning Italy team. Is this success linked to the success of Juventus in the 70s?
Yes, I mean, it's linked to the 78 World Cup, right? There's a lot, also in terms of being aware of the strength of the players. They were ready to fight, to demonstrate the press, the media, the fans that they were wrong because the feeling in Italy before the both World Cups were that we were not going to go anywhere, that we were coming back home soon, very soon. And as often in the Italian football history, when we don't have a lot of expectations, or even better, when we start low, we end up high. 45 seconds in the first game of the 78 World Cup, we played France and France scored. The first three games in the 82 World Cups are three ties, three draws. So where do you go? You don't go anywhere. The reality that, as I was saying, the 78 Italy, to some extent, was maybe the most brilliant team. At least there were some really good moments that we played very good football. And the 82, we managed, maybe also by luck, to play an historic game with Brazil, a legendary game with Brazil. And you know the story of the tournament with Paolo Rossi scoring 6 goals and everything else. So there's no doubt that 82 is the result also of the Juventus block. I think there are 6 players in the starting 11. If you talk to any of the players that were not part of the Juventus block, like Bruno Conti, Giancarlo Antonioni, even Francesco Graziani as a Torino player, they are all very close. They all appreciate how they benefit from being part of this group that was already there. You know, the strong, I would say basically friendship among the players like Cabrini, Scirea, Zoff, Tardelli made something unique and really special. That maybe, honestly, we have seen again in the last 10 years with the backbone of the Juventus defense more recently, or made by Italian players again. But that time was something more natural to some extent. Maybe something that we should remember that only in 1980 Italy allows again foreign players to play, right? So the team from the 70s are all Italian players. The team winning a European Cup in 77 is made by Italian players. So that's very important for the benefit also of the national team.
In closing, what is the legacy of Juventus of this decade in terms of Italian culture and cultural history, especially when you compare it to the teams of the 1980s and the 1990s of the leap years?
Well, the legacy is made by I would say more by the players than the results. As they say, Juventus is the most loved team in Italy, but for the same reason, like in other countries, it's the most hated, right? It's the less popular, right? And for most of the teams, playing Juventus still represents the match of the season. Maybe this is not something they would admit in Milan or in Rome or in Genoa because they have local derbies. But when you play Fiorentina, when you play Napoli, when you play Bologna, when you play Verona, beating Juventus is really the game of the season. But I think the legacy is more linked to the players that made history also at the national level. Because again, when you think of Zoff, Gentile, Cabrini, Furino, Morini, Scirea, I'm telling you the starting 11, basically. Causio, Tardelli, as we were saying, Boninsegna, Benetti, Bettega. These are players and many others that have made history both in the team. And it's quite amazing that you see that some of these players that maybe spent 10 years in another team, but only 2, 3 seasons with Juventus, you hear them talking now and they sound the opposite. They made the recollection or they have a sense of belonging to Juventus more than maybe a team where they've been many, many years. I don't want to say, Boninsegna may be an example. He has been with Inter Milan many, many years, and probably he would still answer, I'm an Inter Milan fan, but he was very keen and close to Juventus. The first time he played Inter Milan after joining Juventus, he scored twice, 2-0, and he celebrated twice. is something that I think it's wonderful, and that now for some, mainstream way of interpreting things, it's a kind of, oh, this is no lack of respect. It's actually the opposite, in my views. It says something about both the caliber of the people and the players, and also what Juventus gave them and what they were able to give to the team.
With that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview. All our respective contact information and the link to your book is listed on the blog and podcast uploads. So, Roberto, thank you once again and hope to continue these discussions on calcio history.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Again, thank you for the opportunity. And it's been a pleasure. And congratulations again. Talk to you soon again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Cheers. Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Grazie.
Grazie.
Ciao.